know, it may just be me, but I really got a feeling like we could catch fire and have a great season, huh? Now, who's with me?
Woo! The electric in the air!
Sometimes may be good, sometimes may be
The Cleats First, Logic Second Football Podcast with your hosts, Alexander Lauber and Phil Almodovar.
Welcome back, one and all, to the Cleats First, Logic Second Football Podcast. Today, Phil, we will be discussing a dreaded topic when it comes to the Premier League, but something necessary in order to move forward in the league and bettering just play overall and officiating, and that is the whole fiasco regarding VAR, or video-assisted refereeing.
Yep, Alex, it's been all over the place this Premier League season. Just controversial calls, controversy between whether it should be used, shouldn't be used, and we're going to dive into it all today.
So, Phil, why don't we start? Give us a little history on video assistant refereeing in general.
Sure. So the concept of video assistant refereeing, or VAR, was first brought into play, or first conceived, in 2010 by the Referee 2.0 project, which is a Dutch football operation to optimize refereeing in the sport of football. It was figmented as pretty much this solution to referees missing calls on the pitch. Originally, this concept was rejected by FIFA chairman at the time, Sepp Blatter. Since then, the new FIFA chairman, after Blatter stepped down, did approve of the concept, and after then, VAR was first used in an experimental capacity in 2016 in an MLS preseason match, basically played by two MLS reserve sides, and things went swimmingly. So in 2018, it was used for the first time in an English match in an FA Cup tie between Brighton and Crystal Palace. From there, it was then later used in multiple Carabao Cup matches that same season and was deemed a possible solution, at least in England. Now, in 2019, after, once again, like I said, being used extensively in cup ties, whether it be in the FA Cup or the Carabao Cup, the clubs of the Premier League anonymously voted to implement VAR for the entirety of the 2019-2020 season, and since then, VAR has become a mainstay in world football.
Yes, it has. So talking specifically about the Premier League, as defined by the Premier League, and if you go onto the Premier League's website, there are a number of articles outlining the rules, the regulations, the guidelines, basically bullet points on the use of VAR within the Premier League. Let's read over a couple of them, we'll discuss, and then we'll get into breaking down the specifics of what we've seen over the last two seasons, and then we'll go into specific data for this season up to this point shortly down the line. Starting off, as defined by the Premier League, all 380 Premier League fixtures in a season will have a VAR who is constantly monitoring the match, but will be used only for, quote, clear and obvious errors, end quote, or, quote, serious missed incidents, end quote, in four match-changing situations: goals, penalty decisions, direct red card incidents, and mistaken identity. So if one player receives a card, but it was meant to go to another player on his team, but the referee gave the card to the wrong player, he can go back to VAR, assess that, and then give the card to the correct player. The final decision will always be taken by the on-field referee. So regardless what he sees on VAR or what he's told by a VAR referee, it's the main official who has say on what that call ends up being. So not in the Premier League's verbiage. Basically, VAR will not review any yellow cards, including second yellows that have led to a player being kicked off on an automatic red, or free kick offenses outside of the box, except for those that have derived from a red card. So, to that point, the Premier League admits that VAR will not achieve 100% accuracy, but will positively influence decision-making and lead to a more correct and fairer judgment. Now, in theory, you would think that VAR and having another set of eyes and the opportunity to go reassess calls would be a good idea, but it's seeming like in certain scenarios, Phil, it's became a crutch. We'll get back into that shortly, and we'll dive in a bit more. But quickly, VAR will automatically check the 4 match-changing situations. Players do not have to ask or signal for it. To that point, as far as players are concerned, they have to continue playing until they hear a whistle. There will be a high bar for VAR intervention on subjective decisions to maintain the pace and intensity of Premier League matches. Why don't we stop there, Phil, and chat about it quickly? So, the reason that VAR has these guidelines and these set restrictions as to when it can be looked at and when it can be taken into effect by a referee is to not interfere with the flow of play. Is that a fair decision?
Well, I think in theory, yeah, sure. If VAR is meant to not interrupt the flow of play, if it's only meant to be used for these, like you said, Alex, and I quote, for match changing situations, yeah, sure. It's like reviewing a play in just about any other sport. However, if you've watched literally any Premier League match this season, that hasn't been the case, at the very least, in my opinion. VAR is being used quite often and does, in my opinion, interrupt the run of play. And the fact that when literally anything happens within the box, any play happens that may be controversial or may have, say, a crunching tackle is made, someone in the box touches the ball and it looks like maybe it grazed their hand. Whenever any of these plays happens, it seems like immediately VAR is brought into the situation, whether it really is a match-changing situation or not.
Yeah, like you said, this is hinting towards my opinion at least. But I think that you do need to find a happy medium between overanalyzing every single hiccup on the field, but at the same time not looking at it at all, because it doesn't necessarily fall under the 4 categories of why an individual can look at that play, or why a referee, I should say, can look at the play. So from there, factual decisions such as whether a player is onside or offside, or inside or outside of the penalty area, will not be subject to the clear and obvious test. Yellow cards will be issued to players who aggressively make the VAR signal to a match official. So if a player does argue for a referee to go check out VAR, they can be carded for it. Real-time speed replays will be used to initially check for intensity, and then slow motion replays will be used to identify point of contact. So, to that point, when a VAR official goes to check out a replay, they'll see it in real time to check out, again, because you have to look at these things in context. In theory, let's break this down, Phil. In theory, there's a lot of times where if you look at a play in normal speed, it doesn't look that bad, and then players are able to walk it off and shake it off easily. But if you look at it in slow motion, it looks like the contact's a lot worse than it is. So we've seen a couple of times where things don't look bad at all, but when you slow it down and break it down, referees tend to pull out cards out of that.
Yeah, Alex, absolutely. And if you look at social media after games, you could see a lot of fans using this to try to intensify their arguments as well, showing specific snapshots, showing things happening in slow motion just to say, oh, this should have been a red card. Meanwhile, in actuality on the pitch, it's not nearly as condemning as it was shown in these slow motions and these actual pictures of what goes on. Really, in theory, in actuality, I should say, the player just took a little bit of a knock, normal play occurrence, and was able to get up afterwards. It's hard to determine intensity of a play when you're watching it just not in real time, Alex. And that's something that has been a big part of this VAR controversy.
Well, that's the thing, right? Because if you're looking at a certain incident, like you said, in real time, it can look perfectly fine. Both players get up and walk away. And if a referee on the field is willing to let that slide, that's one thing. But if you have VAR buzzing into him saying, we think you need to look at this, because they've looked at in slow motion, It just kind of creates more confusion with the referee on the field making the decisions. And something that I think that we're seeing in the Premier League too is referees are less confident in their calls, in their decisions, because they constantly have people above them giving them mixed signals as to what is right and what is wrong. And you have a lot less individual discretion thanks to VAR. And I think that's one of the faults of VAR, especially when those second opinions aren't necessarily the most clear, concise, and helpful in certain situations. So this is a point that we harped on last week. To refresh anyone who hasn't had a chance to check out our episode discussing English referees, which I definitely suggest for you to go check out, the referee will explain their decision to the VAR and what they have seen. If the evidence provided by the broadcast footage does not accord with what the referee believes they have seen, then the VAR can recommend an overturn. So basically, a point that we had made last week was that I believe personally that referees should be held accountable for their decision-making process. In a number of sports in North America, and even in cricket, I believe, referees are mic'd, and even in the Premier League, they're mic'd. However, you can't hear the discussions between the on-field officials and VAR. I believe that another way to hold these referees accountable for their decision is to have that be transparent, to let us hear the decision-making process. Because, Phil, I know you're going to go into communication shortly. However, I do think at the same time, if you can hold these referees accountable for their decision and then even possibly interview them after a match and let them discuss why they made said decision, I think there's a lot of opportunity to grow, and I think positive influence can come from this.
Yeah, Alex, absolutely. We went into it last week about how in sports, like you said, like American football and hockey, for instance, referees, after making their decision, after reviewing a play, face the crowd and the supporters in the audience and say their decision and give a maybe not a detailed explanation, but a brief synopsis as to how they got there. And that's something that we don't see in the Premier League. Once a referee makes a decision, it's either the box signal or some kind of waving hand motion. And that just makes it even more frustrating to fans because all you see is the decision that's actually made and not how it was gotten to there. Like, we get a little bit of a visual of what the referee is seeing kind of through the TV screen when we're watching a broadcast. Like, you could see the offside line that the TV portrayed, the broadcast portrays. You could see the play in slow motion. However, you basically are left to your own devices to say how you think it should be called, rather than the referee saying, well, here's how I came to my decision.
Well, to that point, before we give our opinions further, Phil, why don't you read us over the Premier League's verbiage as far as communication to the fans, so either graphics on the screen or through their digital channels?
Yes, Alex. So in terms of communication to fans of VAR decisions and how VAR is portrayed, it is unsurprisingly very short and concise. Basically, it says that in terms of graphics, when the referee points to his or her ear, that indicates that a VAR review is in place. And that's more or less for the players on the field. Now, in terms of supporters, the supporters will be told of any VAR related delay in play via graphics on the big screen at the stadium, or if the stadium itself does not have a big screen, not all Premier League stadiums do, the decision to have a VAR review will be enunciated through the PA announcer or just messages on the scoreboard if possible. Now, the on-field referee has the option to use the referee review area, which is a screen by the side of the pitch, to view VAR incidents. When the review process is completed, the referee will gesture with a TV signal and communicate the final decision, which, like we all know, is either that gesture with the box, which states that they have changed their decision, or by pointing to whatever decision they had made earlier. Now, in terms of digital channels, in stadiums with a big screen, like I said, if VAR has been involved in changing a decision from the on-field referee, they may broadcast definitive video clips to help explain what had happened. Now, this isn't the referee explaining what had happened. This is just in the stadium. What we see on television when we're watching a broadcast will then be shown to the entire stadium. So that slow motion video, that picture of the onside with the lines, the supporters in the stadium will now be able to see that. Once again, this does not explain at all the referee's point of view. Premier League digital channels will be used when required to clarify any complicated VAR incidents, for example, through the official Twitter account at Premier League. So there can be a little bit of explanation through social media during the match of a decision and how a decision is made. Normally, like we said before, a brief synopsis. Premier League Match Center will provide in-match guidance for VAR queries from media and rights holders. The Premier League's data partner Opta will provide VAR information in their match feeds, which can be seen on the PremierLeague.com match commentaries. All fancy words of saying, if you want an explanation, go online.
And even then, with those explanations, it's not like they're crazy in depth. To that point, Phil, how much better would VAR be if, one, referees are held accountable for their decisions, if VAR officials are held accountable for their decisions, and if there's a level of transparency added to these calls?
I'm not sure, Alex, if VAR would be better. I mean, it would be practically the same thing. I think as fans, though, as supporters, as people who are watching the sport, it would just be a little more comforting, for lack of a better word, to be able to actually know what the referee saw or know what went through the referee's mind when he made the call or ended up reversing the call on the pitch. Because the referee watching VAR and making the change or sticking with the call that he or she made, may still be wrong. The supporters may still say, hey, he or she made the wrong call in the end. However, we at least get to know what went through their mind, what they saw, and yeah, maybe it will influence our decision as well as to whether he or she made the right call. Maybe it won't, but it'll give us that little bit of comfort to say, okay, this is coming straight from the head referee's mouth. This is what he or she saw. This is the call that he or she ended up with. We gotta live with it.
Well, yeah, I agree with you there, but at the same time, I feel like, one, with all the confusion that you have between the way that the PGMOL is training their officials, to the way that VAR is being implemented, to the decisions that the head officials are making, like I've said before, I think that if you teach these people to articulate their decisions, because let's face it, at the end of the day, whether a referee comes out and says, I gave player X a red card because of this, this, and this, or they don't, you're still going to have social media going rampant and attacking that referee, attacking those decisions. You're still going to have people criticizing the calls. You're still going to have people criticizing the play. At least if you give them the chance to discuss it, I think at least by that trial by fire, you are not only forcing these referees to step up, but I think in the long run, it could potentially be beneficial as it forces them to take more of the onus of these calls on their shoulders as they get questioned by media specifically about why they made call X, what they saw, and being able to explain that logic. I think it leads to a lot of teachable points that I think you can find some benefit from. But why don't we jump specifically into the 2021 season? We're not going to go into every specific incident because we only know that there are so many. But just to give a brief overview, the data that we have, so first off, we have the VAR overturns. So when VAR is intervened in a referee's calls and what the decisions have, or how the decisions have benefited teams. So if you look at the 20 Premier League teams this season, and this data is as of February 21st, 2021 at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. So none of this data includes any of the games played on that Sunday. VAR overturns, of the 20 Premier League sides, 9 of them have a positive record, meaning that overall VAR has benefited them rather than hurting them. 6 are neutral, so overall they have neither benefited nor found VAR to be a detriment. And there are 5 clubs to whom VAR has been a detriment in their calls and has impacted them negatively. If we break down the list quickly, Everton is the biggest beneficiary thus far this season by VAR, with 4 VAR overturns in their favor. Burnley and Chelsea sit with +3, Brighton with +2, Leeds and Sheffield as well at +2, and Manchester City, Newcastle, and Southampton sit at +1. Neutral, we have Aston Villa, Crystal Palace, Fulham, Leicester, and Man U. Wolves are -1, Tottenham -3, Arsenal -4, West Brom -5, and go figure, the team that seems like it finds itself on the wrong end of every VAR call, Liverpool sits dead bottom with -6. So Phil, not terribly surprising. I'd actually say it's surprising that more teams have benefited from these VAR calls than found it detrimental. But at the same time, that makes sense. If teams are suffering at the hands of VAR, obviously another team has to be benefiting from it.
Well, yeah, absolutely, Alex. There is 2 sides to the coin, and also it's a net number. This isn't just saying that, oh, there have been 4 VAR overturns for Everton and they've all been in their favor. No. Obviously, teams that are in the positive still have had VAR overturns against them, as teams in the negatives have had VAR overturns in their favor. Now, what's really interesting to see is some of these clubs like Newcastle, like Sheffield United, some of these teams lower in the table do have positive net numbers. Some of these teams higher in the table have lower net numbers. So I don't know if this is actually a great representation of, does this actually affect how you do in the table? However, VAR is still affecting every team. And I think the best way to put this is, despite all these teams that seemingly have benefited, after a match, Newcastle manager Steve Bruce said to the media, after benefiting from a VAR overturn that led to them winning the match, after being asked how happy he was with the victory, Bruce very surprisingly said that it was a really Pyrrhic victory in his mind, as he feels bad for the opposition because he knows that in just about any other match, that could have been Newcastle, or in matches coming up on the road, that could end up being Newcastle, and that isn't fair to them. It shouldn't be fair to the team that they have beaten. So it's really interesting, this outtake of, despite these net numbers here, all teams seemingly have been affected.
Yeah, and even then, when it comes to managers, like you've said, it seems like there's 2 trains of thought. A lot will come out similar to Steve Bruce's stance, where they're not going to criticize it, but when they benefit from it, they'll shrug it off and say, okay, it can happen to anyone, it can happen against or for us, like you said. But then you get people like Nuno Espirito Santos, the manager of Wolves. There have been games where, I believe, a month or 2 ago, Wolves came out, I forget the specific incident, but out of a bad VAR call, he came out after the game, trashed the referees to the media, and then got a massive fine for it. And then, if we remember, one of the most infamous calls of the season, the David Luiz red card, where there was seemingly no contact made in the box, if not minimal, and it was because of William Jose, who it seems like he clipped David Luiz, and then after that was called, he came out and pretty much didn't say anything, but at the same time, there are people who, when they detriment from it, will criticize it, but when they benefit from it, won't shrug it off like Bruce did. But then you'll have people, like, if you even look at Jurgen Klopp, and like you said, Phil, Klopp's been one of the biggest vocal parties against VAR and against these decisions. And even when Liverpool won the league last season, they were still coming out of a lot of VAR calls on the wrong side of things. In Champions League, we saw them come out on the negative side on a number of things, or a big number of things, and they ended up winning too. So you can find yourself on the right end of VAR calls and not necessarily do great, and on the wrong end and do really well, right? So It's not necessarily indicative of everything, but why don't we dive into the number of overturns this season? So overall, there have been 85 calls overturned, 4 rejected. Now, if we break down the 85, calls that had led to goals that then were overturned, 24, leading to disallowed goals, 25, penalties awarded, 19, 4 of those were missed, penalties for handballs, 8, penalties overturned, 16, penalty retakes because of goalkeepers coming off their line, 3, goals ruled out for offsides, 20, goals awarded after incorrect offsides, 6. Goals ruled for handballs, 3, 1 in a build-up, or goals ruled out, sorry. For handballs, 3, 1 in a build-up of the play. Goals allowed after wrong handball, 0. Goals ruled out for a foul, 2. Red cards, 13. Overturned red cards, 1. Mistaken identity, 1. And DOGSO, or denying an obvious goal-scoring opportunity, cancelled, 1. So, not terribly surprising to see those kinds of numbers, Phil. Pretty much calls leading to goals and disallowing goals fairly equal there.
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. And 85 is a big amount too. If you just think of the sheer number, like right now, we're about, I don't know if you would say 2/3, 3/4 of the season through now, but you look at the sheer number of overturns, and that's 85 through that number of matches, which probably through this part of the season, we're probably through just about a couple of hundred matches in the Premier League, maybe more. That's still just about one very important VAR call every 2 matches. In general, not just for a single team, that's in general. That's in the entire Premier League. That's a lot, especially for what VAR is supposed to do.
Yeah, exactly. For some simple clarification or the opportunity to reevaluate calls, it is a lot of calls. Now, again, there are matches where referees will not touch VAR once, but at that same time, there are matches too where a referee will head over a couple of times. So it is concerning to see that many number of VAR calls. Well, actually, why don't we jump straight into the solutions, Phil? When it comes to VAR, is there a way to make it work and non-controversial at the same time?
Well, in terms of drastic solutions, Alex, well, I don't know if you'd say drastic, but two really the most talked about in media. Of course, you have the Dutch solution, which I bet people who watch the sport a lot, who really have analyzed it, have seen a lot. For those of you who haven't, the Dutch solution, which has been used extensively in the Dutch top tier, basically is more for offside calls leading to goals. And what it states is instead of literally using technology to narrow it down to literally the hairs on your skin to whether you're offside or not, a thick line, which will have a certain girth, obviously, will be placed at the edge of the player who was deemed on or offside. And if the line, the offside line, obviously the line of being onside or offside, is touching that line in any way, the player is onside. Now, basically, this obviously takes away that controversy of you could be offside by literally a toe. Now it's just like, okay, you have a little bit of wiggle room. So more often than not, players are going to be onside, which is going to allow more goals, which is going to make more people happy. Is this a solution that the Premier League can employ? I don't know. Now, the other big solution that is less talked about, but at the very least in American media has circulated, is what has been called the NFL adaptation or the NFL solution, NFL standing for National Football League, American football in particular, where in American football, a coach, the head coach of a team, has a certain amount of challenges in a game where he can ask the referee to go look at the play and obviously overchange a call. If the play is not challenged, it's up to the referee's discernment to make the call and nothing else. The referee can't review it. Also, in American football, if it's within the dying embers of the game and is a crucial call, then the referee can look at it if he deems fit. Now, obviously, translating that to the Premier League, each manager of the teams playing would in this scenario be given a certain number of challenges per game, where if they are either scored on or have a penalty called or a red card at any point in the game, they can mandate the referee to go look at the play or call upon VAR to make the final decision. Obviously, this big scenario, this solution would mainly be help of making the game flow a lot better. So less VAR decisions, less going to VAR during a game, more of the referees' calls themselves. And of course, the cons would likely be, well, we're left to referee discernment for most of the game then. Is this really helping or not? Now, the last solution that obviously isn't circulating media that has just been talked about is just retracting VAR altogether, scrapping it, going back to referees' decisions. Now, Alex, now that I've kind of given a brief synopsis, how about you start? Which one of these decisions, if any, seems like the best one of the three and why? And lastly, following that, what would you do if you were in charge of what happens now?
Well, as far as the Dutch solution, I think we're starting to get to the point where, as far as offsides are concerned, they're starting to figure it out a bit better. Hopefully, they've learned from the numerous mistakes that they've made over the last 2 seasons. You think that they would have learned after Bournemouth essentially got relegated based off of a missed offside call. We won't go there, but nonetheless, I don't think that the Dutch solution is necessarily the solution to solve the VAR crisis. The NFL adaptation is interesting. If you look at hockey too, coaches' challenges have been implemented. American football isn't known to be a fluid sport. It's very start-stoppy, choppy, and it seems like most of the time is spent not actually playing. So we won't go into that too heavily as far as I'm concerned. But however, I think hockey could be a better option, as is a lot more fluid gameplay and a lot less broken up and interfered. My only question, and I'll put this out to you, Phil. In hockey, you're allowed your certain amount of coaches' challenges, realistically 1. If you make the challenge and you're wrong, so if you try and challenge a goal and you're wrong and that goal stands, you lose a timeout. And this is basically a way to moderate coaches so they're not just challenging every single decision or every single goal or every single what have you. Phil, I'll put out the question to you. If they were to go after this type of a format or a coach's challenge, how could you penalize a team for just throwing out faulty challenges?
Now, it's really interesting, Alex. Obviously, there would have to be a cap on the amount of challenges that you could have in a game in the first place. But like you said, kind of to not have managers being able to throw it out. We've had many different things in sports, whether it's, like you said, losing a timeout, or in hockey, I believe too, if you coaches challenge and you get it wrong, you have a penalty against you, like a power play against you, which obviously in hockey, you're not guaranteed a goal if that happens. In a sport like football, obviously the first thing you could say is, well, penalty kick. But obviously penalty kicks, you're more or less guaranteed most of the time a goal. So that's not the answer. Maybe a free kick from where the VAR decision happened. So whether it be a red card decision, if you get the red card decision wrong, the opposing team gets a free kick or something like that. I don't know exactly how you would do it. It's an interesting concept of penalizing a team, or maybe you lose a substitution. I don't know exactly how it would work. It's much more interesting in football than it is in other sports where you see it. But I think at the very least, having a cap on it would help.
Yeah, I don't know. You'd have to cap it off, but to that point, I don't think that that's the solution. I don't think retracting VAR is the solution either, quite frankly, because at the end of the day, video assistant refereeing is to help a referee or the main match official see what he can't see in the natural flow of play, whether it's because of limited vision, because of the speed of the play, if he's focusing on something else and something happens behind him, I think you need video assistant refereeing to be there to some capacity. However, at the same time, especially when it comes to Premier League, we discussed this in the last episode. First and foremost, I think the PGMOL needs a total overhaul. Who's training the referees? Who's regulating these rules? That needs to be reassessed, and that's on the English FA. However, I do think that as opposed to retracting it, if anything, I would give referees some more leniency as to when they can and cannot reference video assistant refereeing, even if it is just to run over, check out what just happened, and run back in. Because at first, honestly, it sounds like it'd be a crutch, and it's like, okay, the referee's going to be running over every 2 minutes to check. And I don't think that's the case. If anything, I have a feeling that they're going to be heading over less frequently. And yes, you can have an official pop on the headset and say, we think you need to go see this, or we don't think you need to go see this. But because it is that referee's discretion and decision, I think it should be up to that individual as to when they feel they need to see what happened. Because at the end of the day, if a referee is hard-headed in their decision, whether someone is telling them to go check it out or not, whether they want to go over to it or not, and whether they want to make a call or not, at the end of the day, they're not being held accountable. So I think if you can allow for a greater amount of leniency, but also tie that in to forcing them to take on the onus, whether it be projecting to fans that conversation between them and the VAR officials, or having them speak to the media after matches to explain decisions, I think that's a way of regulating that and getting them in line. And I think if it's done right, because in theory, VAR makes a match perfect, and we've seen it's far from that. However, I think if you loosen up the reins, but also force them to stay within the lines, I can see it working out better than it currently is.
Yeah, and I think, Alex, I don't think VAR itself is exactly the issue. I think the way it's portrayed is an issue. I think, yeah, like you said, Alex, referees need to have more agreement rather than someone yelling at them in their ear, hey, you got to look at this. Be like, okay, I might need to take another look at this call. Let me take a look at it, instead of someone barking in their ear, hey, I think you got this one wrong. If I watch this in 10 times super slow-mo, it looks like he almost broke his leg. It should be more agreement of the referee because he's the one watching the match in full time with all the players literally feet in front of him. He has the best seat in the house. He should be the one making the decisions on, okay, should I take a look at this? Did I think I made the right call? Do I think I even need to? Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think also, like we said in the previous video, transparency is a huge issue with the PGMOL. I think too, we should literally have, Alex, videos sent to us of what is and isn't a handball, what is and isn't offside, what is and isn't a penalty, what is and isn't a red card. That'd be really nice because it just doesn't seem black and white anymore. It seems more like there's so much more gray areas to the game than there were a few years ago. And it's frustrating for the fans. So I think more of an issue is on transparency, as we highlighted in the previous video, than on VAR. But do changes need to happen with the VAR? Yeah, sure, absolutely. And Alex, I think you highlighted that pretty well.
Well, look, I don't think that you're going to have perfectly black and white decisions as to what a red card is and what a handball is and what an offside is, because at the end of the day, every single play is going to be different and be unique. I do think that you need to have strict guidelines as to have match officials know what is what. Do I think that it needs to be set out and made transparent, like you said, in sending out videos or having them accessible? Not necessarily, because look, at the end of the day, if your refereeing is consistent, precedent should be set by because in theory, every decision that a PGMOL certified referee makes is precedent to justify that call being made or not being made in the future. If something's giving a red card today, and the same thing happens 2 years down the line, you should be able to look back and say, okay, that happened here, this is a red card. In theory. And one of the biggest problems that we've had is discrepancies from one play to another, to one game to the other. So I think, like I said, I don't think it's ever going to be black or white. It's just clarifying the gray and helping the referees, or helping provide them better discretion to tread through that murky gray area. The other thing that's came to mind too I want to know what you think of it because it's an interesting point. We've talked about this in the past when it comes to analytics, and I'll just go over the idea quickly. When it comes to analytics, especially in a variety of sports that hasn't traditionally existed in, buy-in is a big issue. Because whether it be European football, American football, baseball or hockey, what have you, you're always going to have traditional minds who think that the eye test is the be-all and end-all. You're also going to have people who think that numbers can help influence those decisions. You obviously have people on the other side of the spectrum who think that numbers are the be-all and end-all. However, at the least, you need to have within the entire organization someone, or you have to have people within the entire organization in different capacities who are at least open-minded to this new feature, this new technology. I have a feeling, even though it hasn't been articulated, because a lot of these referees aren't able to come out and speak about it, you have to imagine that there's a number of older referees or people who have been refereeing for a number of years who are opposed to VAR. It's just a thought. People who will adamantly say, I'm not checking out that monitor, I'm not going to come look at play X, Y, or Z, because I haven't had that in my 20 years prior, so why should I have to start looking at it now? So I'd question too, and I'm curious to see what you think, Phil. Do you think that buy-in is an issue within some of the referees, even though that's not discussed at all?
I mean, that's a great question, Alex. I'm not so sure. I mean, we can't go into the minds of these individual referees. And like you said, having all kinds of opinions throughout the PGMOL, do we really have that? If I were to take a wild guess, I'd probably say no. Because, Alex, the PGMOL, as we discussed last week, is meant to create these close to perfect referees, and obviously they're all supposed to have the same decision-making skills, the same opinions on calls, stuff like that. So do you really have a variation, even when it comes to just opinion on VAR, how it should be used, what it should be used for? Do I look? Do I not look? I don't know. I if I were to guess, probably not. But obviously we don't have that information. Can that be an issue too? Sure. And you highlighted that once again pretty well, that, yeah, that could end up being an issue. When you look at like, just for example, another sport like American football or hockey, you tend to have different minds in different positions, whether that be in officiating, ownership, wherever you want to take a look at it. So do we need to have in English football, per se, more of a representation on all of the different, I don't know if you'd say, opinions on officiating in the PGMOL rather than just this one guy who's the head of it all? Maybe.
Yeah, I think to wrap up there, is VAR the worst thing to happen to the sport? No. Has it benefited as it was intended? Not close to it. Not remotely. It needs work. And like we've said last week, this is only scratching the surface on the topic. You can dig into this way, way, way deeper than we will. I'm sure in the future we'll revisit this, reassess, and dig a bit deeper. However, that wraps it up for today. Make sure to tune in next week as we have a new topic in mind, something pretty interesting, some news coming from a former Premier League giant who have now quieted down a couple of leagues further down, and we'll explore topics surrounding the idea of bringing a team back to its former glory through reinvesting.
Yes, Alex, is it worth it to invest in a club with a massive history and a struggling current situation? We'll go through that all next week. Until then, remember, meat first, soccer second. Have a great week.